You're watching Straight Line with Dan Rogers, President and CEO of Cherry Stream Mission Ministries.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Straight Line. I am your host, Molly Elrod, and I am here again with Dan Rogers. And Dan, today we are going to be talking about a touchier subject, that of which is sexuality. Can you unpack what that looks like for us today?
You bet. Well, we should say to our viewing audience, and from one parent to another, this material today and content that we're talking about today is not for child consumption. So we would just encourage you to monitor on that side of the TV screen what's going on in your own family. That being said, Molly, today's topic on sexuality is very purposeful in the fact that we did not choose the prefix. We're not really talking about homosexuality today or heterosexuality or any other levels of even divergent sexuality that's going on in our community. And we will definitely, in future shows, go down those avenues. But today's topic is on sexuality. And our companion today on stage, in just a quick minute, is going to be Sharon McQuarrie. Sharon is one of our region's foremost authorities on this topic of sexuality. And in fact, God had led her several years ago to begin a ministry to women in industry that I think is would soon be forgotten by most people, and unfortunately I think the church as well. Sharon has decided to do something quite illegitimate, and not illegitimate to you and me or even to our viewers today, certainly not illegitimate to God or illegitimate to the gospel of Jesus Christ, but illegitimate in the way of we don't think we should be doing this, and we're going to have her on stage today and she's going to chat about it.
Great. So what does that look like to the church on this particular topic? I know we'll get into it more later, but why are there things that the church just doesn't know about, or it's not so black and white that this may be such a topic that they even need to be concerned about?
Well, it's a great question. I think there are two issues going on in our community. One is we already think we know everything there is to know about this topic, sexuality. And then secondly, it scares us to death. I mean, honestly, think about the way that we're, even as parents, scared about sexuality among our own children. And I'm not at all suggesting you as parents, I'm a parent and a grandparent myself, these things should be addressed, should be addressed early and thoroughly. But Molly, I think the great challenge to the church specifically is to be a leader in this topic. Who else is qualified? And this is a predominant theme on Straight Line, right, is who else is better qualified than the institution of the church, you and me, and others like us, to address these very valuable topics.
That's great. So basically you're giving a charge to the parents of the church and to the church.
And we will. So we went over to Sharon's house and got her on film the other day, and she'll be here in a quick minute to share her story with us. Let's watch.
Hi, my name is Sharon. I began in the sex industry when I was 15 years old. It took a little while to get there, but the story goes like this. My mom and dad divorced by the time I was 4 years old, and so I grew up in a single-mothered home, and my mom did what she had to do to make life happen for us, for my siblings and I. By the time I was 14 years old, having grown up in a place where my sexuality really was front and center, by the time I was 14, I decided that I would pay my way through college by stripping. So at 15 years old, a family member had paid me to go into a university classroom wearing very little clothes. I was wearing a men's shirt with a tie and some underwear type items underneath of it. And I walked into a college classroom full of kids, probably about up to 50 maybe, and with a boombox, set the boombox down, and I began to do a striptease. The moment was really surreal. It was my first time ever having done anything like that, but it fed that need for affirmation inside of me. It made me feel as if I was wanted, as if I was needed for something. And so I did the deed. I went in, took my clothes off, listened to the cheers, listened to the claps, and walked out on probably a pretty high adrenaline rush. But in that moment, it solidified for me that this is what I was going to do. And so I spent the better part of my high school years going to high school. Amazingly, I didn't fail out. But living two different lives, living this life at school and then living the life afterwards, where I was willing to go to parties and do whatever needed to be done to entertain the crowd and to make people like me and want me. And so when I turned 18, I didn't know at that time that I could go work at a club with a fake ID. I was naive enough to not realize that. And so I waited. So then when I turned 18 years old, I walked into a club in Toledo and began a life of exotic dancing. And I'm kind of a go-at-it-all kind of person. And so dancing for me was very quickly not enough. I wanted to be that Playboy playmate. I wanted to be on tour, on circuit, and I wanted to win the accolades from people, and have people like me and want me and think that I'm beautiful. So a typical night working for me in the club was going to work at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and heading in, getting my hair done, getting my makeup on, obviously lots of stage makeup, and picking out the right outfits for the night and the right music for the night. And we would start the night with what was called, kind of jokingly, a cattle call, where all of the women were paraded up on the stage and introduced, and the men that were there would be able to see who the products were, who the show was for the night. And so we started the night with that, and then I would spend my night going around to the different men, and even sometimes women, that would be in the clubs, and dancing for them. There was no touching. It was very much a nudity situation, but a 3-foot kind of distance maintained so that nobody was touching me, I was not touching anybody. And that made it okay for me. It made it not prostitution. It made it not selling myself. It made it an art form for me, the ability for me to say, this is art. And so I spent 3 years doing that, and loved it in the moment, in the brokenness that I was in. It was a very lonely place to be, even in the middle of all of the praise and the affirmation and the dollar bills being tossed, or even bigger bills being tossed. In the middle of all of that, when there's this crowd of people around you, it was still lonely. There were very few people that were really your friend. It was a lot of women who were competing to have the attention of anyone who walked through the door. And so there was really never this place where you knew true intimacy with another person or true friendship with another person like you might have at another job. But it was work, and it was what I had convinced myself that I wanted to do. I didn't go to college during that time. I tried, I failed a lot, because you can't go to work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, get off work at 4 o'clock in the morning, and be on an adrenaline high that keeps you out shopping till 6 or 7, and then go to school and make it. It's a myth. And some people I know did it, but I couldn't in the life that I was living. And so that's me.
And so there you go. You heard Sharon say it herself. That's her. That's Sharon, is your story. You know, Sharon, one of the things that I've always been intrigued by you, particularly in our friendship, is there was a moment in your life that's, and you said it on video today, there was a moment in your life that you were desperately trying to convince yourself that what you were doing was an art form, and it really wasn't selling you, it wasn't selling your soul, but it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a spot during that time in my life. I would have argued to the hilt with you that what I was doing was a free will choice, that what I was doing was something that I longed to do and dreamed to do, and that I had every right to do that. And by my own standards, I would say I did. Like, I did have the right to make the choices that I was making. The problem was that I didn't understand the motivation behind those choices and the gravity of what was happening in making those. And so I was living a life full of a lot of bad circumstances that were causing me to make really bad choices, all the while thinking, this is okay, I'll be okay. There's nothing wrong with this, or if you think there's something wrong with it, that's your own problem. And the reality is I had to come to a spot where I knew within myself that wasn't where I was supposed to be.
You know, Sharon, I'm afraid that still in our community and in our societal think, and I'm afraid, and I really want you to address this with us today, that maybe even in the church, we struggle with whether this is really victim, whether this is just a victimless thing. And people do what they want to do. You said as a young woman, you were making a free choice, but I'm afraid, Sharon, that still in our community there's this mindset, if not a mind bend, that this is victimless.
It's not victimless. 87% was the latest statistic of women in the sex industry were either misused or abused as children before they turned 18 years old. 87%. What we know about sexual statistics is that they're never thorough enough.
Right.
We always have shame and guilt that keep us from telling the truth. And so if 87% are willing to say, hey, that's me, I'm sure that there are more that are falling into that statistic. And then beyond that, if they weren't victims walking into it, they were raped, assaulted, molested in the position that they were in. The job was taken 10 times farther than it was ever meant to go.
So you're actually talking
when
in
they're
the
actually
industry itself.
Yeah, the women in the industry. So at some point, not all women in the industry, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to say that all of the women in the industry are victims of some kind of misuse or abuse. But many, many, many of them are. The issue with the sex industry goes beyond the women or the men participating. It goes to their families. I've personally seen families destroyed because of husbands or fathers in clubs and walking down a path that really, honestly, is just not seeing an individual human being, whether it's their wife, their child, or the woman that they're using, as a human. It's just not.
Well, that's shame and guilt. Even Molly, you know, as you're a woman and you're in this topic as well, you know, shame and guilt is such a big issue for everybody. But when you compound that with sexuality, there's something, and again, sexuality is not about the spirit as much as it's about the soul, right? It's about who we are, right? And so let's chat for a quick minute. Would you guys mind about this whole issue of shame, regret, and embarrassment, and how that not only enslaves but continues to entrap people in cyclical issues like sex industry?
Sharon, I have a question. I am somewhat uneducated about this, as I'm sure many of our viewers are, but what my question is from being in the industry and even in the work you're in now, what percentage would you say started off with doing this just as a side thing to earn money and got into drugs? I mean, I think of solicitation and earning money to support a habit is by far the #1 reason to do something like this. So is that, you know, your story is a little bit different, that you started off for the attention and trying to fix something that was quote unquote broken in your life and filling that need. So that's your avenue, but for a majority of the women that are in this industry, is it to fuel a drug habit?
No, I meet women regularly that are not addicted to any type of substance. The issue is never what's on the surface, and it's always beyond. We must be very careful to not take our story and translate that onto the other women that I meet. Specifically myself. My story is my story, and giving room to people to share their stories is needed in the church so that we can have that understanding. But I don't think that we could across the board say that, oh, they must have a drug problem, or oh, they must have some huge issue that caused them to be there. A lot of times it feeds that. It does lead to drug problems. It does lead to alcoholism. There are things that you do to cope with what you found, the situation that you found yourself in. But it's not typecast
Absolutely,
the whole
yeah.
group of people that are in this situation. There are a lot of predictors, like 87% of them being misused as children. There are a lot of things that we can look and see the pattern in their life. But Dan, I want to get back to your question of the church and what we were talking about of guilt and shame.
Sure.
Because when we start looking at that, when I came out of the industry, the way I got out was I became pregnant. My body was my moneymaker. I did things to not get in that situation, and lo and behold, I did. And I continued to dance for a while after that. I danced till I was 8 months pregnant, and then I started taking other jobs in the business. And it took me until my daughter was about a year old to finally say, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this. And I kept going home at night and looking at her. And ultimately, having been raised with a Christian value in a Christian home and having great Christian grandparents, I kept going home to my daughter and going, how can I want anything? I don't want my life for her. And if I'm doing it, how could it be okay for her? And that is really the means of salvation that Christ brought. And I ended up going back to the church pretty quickly. And there's a situation that we had where I would go to church and I would get down at the altar every single Sunday because of guilt, because of shame, because of remorse for everything that I had done. And the funny thing was every single Sunday I'd get down there and I'd bawl my eyes out and I'd have this moment and I'd get right back up and carry the junk with me. And a woman in the church finally realized what I was doing in the fact that she saw me go every week, and she was, well, what's going on with that? Can we talk about it? And I did talk to her about it, and it was this first time in the church where I just said, this is all that I've done, and I don't know how to fix it, and I don't know that God would ever forgive me for all of this stuff. And I told her the whole story, told her how I got out, and at that point in time, I knew God enough, and I had a relationship with him as a young child to know that my daughter was a gift from him, that when I couldn't care for myself, he knew that I could care for someone else. And so I communicated that to her, and her response to me in the church was, how dare I call my child born in sin a gift from God? Very quickly, things in this church shifted. I was no longer asked to sing. I wasn't asked to be in the nursery or working with the kids. So not only did she have the nerve
Because people now knew your story?
Yeah, because not only did she say that to me, but apparently she shared it
Okay.
with people.
And up until this point, you had shielded the church from your past.
Yeah, I went into the church and
which is fair.
Which is fair. You walk in and you don't know what to do. You don't know if you're safe. You don't know if it's a. And I would say that no matter where we've been and no matter what our stories are, when we enter the church, that is the climate that we go into. Is this place safe for me? And she taught me it wasn't. And so very quickly I ended up deciding I can't go to church here anymore. And I walked into a different church, and I learned out of that situation that I don't share it. I don't talk about it. I don't need to tell people about it. It's my business. Okay. And through the years of doing that to myself, taking that guilt and shame and wearing it, and hearing the message over and over and over that all of these types of things, premarital sex,
sure,
strip clubs, all that, it's just
well,
horrible.
Our topic today, sexuality.
Yeah, all of sexuality is bad.
Right.
And so hearing that only compounded what was going on inside of me, and only caused me to have more guilt and more shame. And I began to live a life for God that was very much about how can I earn His love. And the reality is that it was always there, it never left.
Well, here's the interesting thing, Sharon. You decided to do something that most people wouldn't do, right? Mm-hmm. You were in hell, both literally and figuratively, behaviorally, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, in every way, living a hellacious life. And now, many years later, because you've been out of the industry and free for 16 years, yep, right? You've actually decided to run back into hell, yes, right? So you have founded this ministry to women in the industry, which I consider from the day that I heard about you and your ministry quite unique, called Free to Be Me. Yeah. Talk to us about the logo that is on the screen right now, because this came from a very unusual place and has great symbolism in it. Can you explain it to our viewers?
Yeah, the logo that's on the screen was created by a woman that we have encountered and met and developed a relationship with inside of some of Toledo's clubs. And the circumstances of it were, it's a long story, but the gist of it is that there's so much symbolism in here. As a stripper, your shoe is the one thing that you keep on. It's a symbol of who you are. A stripper is nothing without her shoe. When everything else is stripped away, the shoe remains. And this young lady designed this logo for us. And the story goes is that was her shoe. When she moved on in the industry, that's the one thing she saved. It's the one thing that she keeps as a reminder. And she drew this for us. And what God had done in her in that moment was that she had discovered, probably for the first time in her life, that she was on a journey with God. So the wings symbolize the journey that she's on with God, obviously the cross. And then the circling around symbolizes the idea that she realized that she's on a journey with God, and that sometimes it takes a lot of circling to land on the runway. And so we just had this beautiful moment between her and I as she designed this for us. And it has become kind of our, not kind of, but it's been put on our t-shirts. It's been put on a lot of our stuff that we do when we approach the church. And so it's a fabulous story of what it looks like, and to know that the women that we serve, while they're in the middle of hell, in the middle of darkness, there is great light.
So one of the things you do, Sharon, if not the only thing you do, only being not a great word to use for what you do, is you actually serve lovingly women who are still in the industry, in the stripping industry, as you were once in the industry yourself. Tell us the ways that you serve them right now.
The ways that we serve them right now, we go directly into some of Toledo's strip clubs, and our message is not one of condemnation, it's not one of shame, not one of guilt. It is simply a message of love. We believe thoroughly that the women that we encounter are children of God. They were created in the very image of God and deserve to be treated with respect and love. And so we go into clubs and develop relationships with the women that we encounter and that we meet. In doing that, we offer a lot of practical things, hygiene products. We take Christmas gifts, not just for the women, but for their children. We offer sometimes book clubs or Bible studies if the time is right for that. And then we also do a lot of life coaching and one-on-one counseling with the ladies. There are a million and one things. Basically, if you think of how you would want to be loved,
yes,
and the things that you need in your life to know that you are on a solid ground or that you're at least on the right path, we do those things. We come alongside as a friend to say, hey, here we are. We don't set an agenda.
Well, one of the most amazing things about that, Sharon, is the generous love that you're giving to these ladies. You would love for them to be out of the industry.
Yeah.
That's not your point.
Right.
Is it?
No, it's not. I mean, there's not a spot. For me, I'm going to tell you, Dan, there were a lot of people who would have loved for me to be out of the industry. And there was nothing that they could say or do to get me there. All it did was fuel me more or hurt me more. Really, what it came down to for me is I had to make a decision. Myself, within myself, and we know this is biblical principles of rescue, that I had to want it more for me than anybody else could want it for me. And so we developed that relationship, and we show them that there is another way, that light can come.
Well, Sharon, you have done a lot of work with me and Cherry Street Mission Ministries in biblical advocacy and reaching women, particularly at the Sparrow's Nest. You know, many people have asked me from a few years ago now, hey, Dan, is Cherry Street Mission Ministries involved in this sex trafficking issue that's now really emerging in our Toledo region? And the reality is, since we started the Sparrow's Nest back in the early 30s, we have always been in the sex trafficking conversation, because the Sparrow's Nest is all about helping women who have been battered about, sometimes domestically, oftentimes, as you said, in some abusive situation that has landed them squarely in some sex industry, whether it was just out and out prostitutions right on the street, or whether it was in an industry that was privatized, or yes, in some cases, of course, trafficked from one community to the other. And as you listen to today's topic and you hear what Sharon has to say, I just want to inform you that you are a vital link to break the link relative to sexuality and how that's feeding our sex industry. And can I make a plea? The church is the one institution. This is not going to happen judiciously. This is not going to happen through our penal codes. This will not happen because we encourage more police traffic in our neighborhoods. All of those things are vitally important. But it is the church who is supposed to be the social engineer and the social architect for better community and better environments. And sexuality is one of those topics that we are fully capable of wrapping our hands around and doing something about it. I love what Sharon has done because she's demonstrating the love to people that frankly are in a loveless situation and wouldn't have imagined in a lifetime, even as you've heard Sharon's story today, that they could ever be loved. Sharon, in these last 2 moments that we have before we close today's program, could you encourage the church? What is the 1 or 2 things that they could begin doing right now to reverse trends in their own lives relative to sex industry in our community?
Yes. Part of what happened for me was embracing my own story. For years, I ran from it. I did everything I could to look good, to smell good, and to act good, and to be at a spot where people would just love me. And all the while, I didn't love myself. And so part of the number one thing the church has to do is begin to love ourselves, to take our stories, to take who we are and say, you know what, God was in that. He didn't cause it, he didn't make it happen, he probably didn't bless it, probably didn't condone it, but he was in there loving me in that moment in every single place. And never once has he left me or forsake me. And when I can begin, if we as a church can begin to do that, we free ourselves and we can begin to look at other people with the same grace and the same love and understand that God is in their life at the same places. And so that's probably the number one thing that we have to do. We have to be at a spot where we can be free to be ourselves so that we can be free to love other people in the way that God would love them. Some of the other things that we can do in the church is begin to talk about sexuality. We can't keep silent. The evil one works and lurks in darkness. And as long as we keep this idea of sexuality in darkness, it will always stay in darkness and he will wreak havoc on it. And so if we begin to speak about it in a loving way, believe me, I was raised in the church. We talked about sex. It's bad. It's horrible. Don't do it. Let's stop talking that way.
Right.
And let's start talking about how we can produce change.
So there you go, folks. Love yourself. Start talking honestly about what's going on in your family and community.